At 3:14 in the morning, military vehicles blocked every exit of Harlow General Hospital. Not police, not ambulances, soldiers, armed, moving fast, radios crackling in the dark. Inside, a trauma surgeon stood over a dying patient with the wrong instruments in his hands, too proud to admit he had no idea what he was looking at. Down the hall, a nurse was walking toward the exit with a cardboard box and rain on her jacket. Fired 20 minutes ago, humiliated in front of everyone she worked with. She had almost made it to the parking lot, almost. Then the alarm went off, and she stopped. If this story has you hooked already, follow along to the end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The overnight shift at Harlow General started the same way it always did, short-staffed, underlit, and running on bad coffee and habit. Emma Vasquez arrived at 5:47 a.m. 13 minutes before her shift technically began, because that was the only way to get ahead of the handoff notes before the day team swept in and claimed the good charts. She was 28 years old, medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back so tight it gave her headaches by noon. Her scrubs were plain navy. Her shoes were the kind you bought for function, not appearance. Thick-soled, waterproof, already showing wear at the heel. She had a small scar along her left jaw that she never explained, and people had mostly stopped asking about. She worked in the ER at Harlow General Hospital in Denton City, a Level 2 trauma center that operated at the edge of its capacity on an average Tuesday and completely fell apart on bad weekends. The building itself was 12 stories of poured concrete and outdated signage, the kind of hospital that had been renovated 3 times in 30 years without ever quite catching up to itself. The emergency department lived on the ground floor, wrapped around a central nursing station that always smelled faintly of antiseptic and burned microwave food. Emma clocked in, poured herself a half cup of coffee from the pot that had been sitting since 4 a.m., and started reading. The night had been busy. 2 MVCs, 1 pediatric asthma case that had scared everybody before stabilizing around 2 a.m., a psych hold that was still pending placement, and a chest pain workup in Bay 7 that the outgoing nurse had flagged as not quite right. EKG inconclusive, patient insisting he was fine, vitals slightly off in a way that didn't add up to anything clean. Emma circled that one and wrote watch in the margin of her own notes. She was mid-sentence in the chart when the break room door opened and Dr. Marcus Rowe walked in. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She recognized the weight of his footsteps, that particular cadence of someone who moved through spaces as though he'd already claimed them. Rowe was the trauma chief, 46 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something harder. He had trained at a program in the Northeast that he mentioned often enough that people had started mentally finishing the sentence for him. He wore his white coat like a uniform, always pressed, always buttoned. He had a habit of speaking at a volume that suggested he assumed everyone in the room was listening, even in a private conversation, even when no one had asked. He poured coffee without acknowledging her. Emma kept reading. Vasquez. Morning, she said, Ma'am. You were in Bay 4 last night. I was off last night. That was Dina. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. Somewhere in between, a small noise that communicated that the details weren't worth his time. He leaned against the counter with his coffee and glanced at the papers she was reading. You know you don't have to read every note from overnight, he said. That's what the huddle is for. I know. Some of us have been doing this long enough that we can walk in cold and handle whatever's there. Emma looked up from the chart. Good for some of us, she said, and went back to reading. There was a beat of silence. Rowe left without responding, which was its own kind of response. She heard him stop in the hallway, say something to one of the residents in a louder, more generous voice, something that got a laugh. And then his footsteps continued toward the trauma bay. Emma finished her coffee. She went to check on the chest pain in Bay 7. The patient's name was Gerald Odom. 63, retired, came in at 2 a.m. complaining of pressure in the center of his chest that he'd been trying to ignore for 6 hours before his wife finally called 911. He was the kind of man who described pain in careful understatements. A little discomfort, some tightness, nothing I can't handle. which in Emma's experience meant the opposite of nothing. His EKG from the night before showed a subtle finding that the outgoing nurse had flagged. A slight elevation in lead V3 that might be noise, might be early ischemia, might be nothing. His troponin had come back borderline, not elevated enough to trigger the STEMI protocol, not normal enough to send him home. Emma sat down beside his bed, which she'd learned early on made patients talk more than standing did. "Any pain right now?" she asked. "A little. In my arm, mostly. Left one." "Since when?" "Came and went overnight. It's there now." "On a scale of 1 to 10? He thought about it. 4, maybe 5. Emma noted it. She pulled up his chart on the wall panel, ran through the overnight labs, and looked at the rhythm strip again. The elevation was still there. Small, but persistent. She went to find the attending. The attending on that morning was Dr. Felicia Marsh, a solid internist who had covered overnight and was in the middle of signing out to the day team. Emma caught her in the hall between the nursing station and the elevator bank and laid out what she was seeing: borderline troponin, persistent ST change in V3, new onset left arm pain. Marsh listened, nodded. "Repeat troponin in 3 hours, serial EKGs, get cardiology on the phone. Tell them borderline presentation, not emergent, but I want their eyes on it." "Got it." "Good catch," Marsh said, and stepped onto the elevator. Emma went back to put in the orders. She was entering them into the system when Rowe appeared at the nursing station, reading something on his phone, and glanced over at what she was doing. "What's this for?" "Bay 7, chest pain workup." Troponin was borderline. "Yes." "So it's probably nothing." Emma kept her eyes on the screen. "I'm doing serial labs and an EKG repeat." Marsh agreed. Rowe leaned against the counter beside her. He lowered his voice, but not enough. 2 of the residents were 15 feet away, and there was no question they could hear. "You know what the problem is with nurses who read too many charts? They start seeing patterns that aren't there. It's called confirmation bias. The troponin is borderline. The EKG is borderline. That means it's borderline, not a heart attack." "I didn't say heart attack." "You ordered a cardiology consult." "Marsh ordered it." He straightened up. "I'm flagging it as a low acuity workup and moving him down the list. We have actual emergencies coming in." Emma turned to look at him directly. "With respect, Dr. Rowe, the arm pain is new onset since last night. That changes the picture." "I appreciate the input," he said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. "I'll take it from here." He walked away. The residents found somewhere else to look. Emma stood at the nursing station for a moment. Then she went back into Bay 7 and checked on Gerald Odom herself every 30 minutes for the next 2 hours. At 9:15, his third troponin came back elevated, significantly. Cardiology was already on their way. He went to the cath lab by 10 a.m. The interventional cardiologist called back at noon to report a 90% occlusion of the LAD, treated successfully. Gerald Odom would be fine. Rowe's name wasn't on any of the orders. Emma had made sure of that. She had no interest in the argument. She just wanted the patient to not die. By 2 in the afternoon, the ER was running the way ER departments ran on cold Thursdays in February. Steadily, without grace, absorbing everything the city threw at it and leaking a little at the edges. Emma had been on her feet for 8 hours. She'd eaten half a granola bar over a patient chart and forgotten about the other half somewhere in Bay 3. She was triaging a walk-in. Young woman, wrist pain after a fall, clearly more frightened than injured, when she heard the radio traffic pick up at the ambulance bay doors. That sound had a specific quality. The way voices overlapped, the particular shorthand the paramedics used when they were moving fast. Emma had spent enough time in places where those sounds meant something immediate and serious that her body still responded before her brain caught up. Something tightened behind her sternum. She finished with the wrist injury, got the patient to a tech, and moved toward the bay. The ambulance backed in hard. The doors were open before it stopped. Blast trauma, military, male, mid-30s, the paramedic was saying rapidly, hands still on the gurney. Found down at a demolitions training exercise outside the city, transferred in from the incident site. BP was 74/40 at the scene, dropped to 68 on transport. Breath sounds decreased on the right. GCS 12 dropped to 10 in the last 4 minutes. Rowe was already there. He'd materialized from somewhere. Trauma Bay had been notified. The team assembling around him like he was the center of gravity. "Let's go," Rowe said. "Trauma 1. The gurney moved. Emma moved with it. The soldier on the table was a large man built like someone who had spent years carrying weight in difficult places. His uniform was torn across the right side, his face pale with the specific pallor of someone losing blood pressure. Not blanched, not flushed, but gray in a way that had a biological logic Emma recognized. He was conscious, minimally. His eyes tracked movement, but he wasn't answering questions clearly. "Intubate him," Rose said. "Wait," Emma said. Nobody listened, which was normal. She moved to the right side of the gurney while the team worked and looked at the chest. Really looked. "Decreased breath sounds on the right," the paramedic had said. She put her hand along the trachea gently. It deviated, barely, but it deviated. She looked at the neck veins, distended. "Dr. Rowe," she said, "I think this is tension pneumo. His pressure's tanking. We need access and fluids. Intubating a tension pneumo will kill him. Positive pressure will—" "I know what positive pressure does, thank you." He didn't look at her. 2 large-bore IVs, bilateral. The tracheal deviation, Vasquez. He said her name like he was putting something down on a table. Final, unequivocal. "I have this. Step back." She stepped back. 1 step. She looked at the monitor. The BP read 64/38 now, and the tracing on the cardiac monitor was the compressed, rapid pattern of a heart working too hard against too much pressure. "Dr. Rowe, please look at the neck." Her voice was steady. Not loud. Not aggressive. The tone of someone who has been in rooms like this before and knows exactly how much time is left. "The JVD is bilateral. Decreased sounds on the right. This isn't hemorrhagic. There's no mechanism for hemorrhagic at this BP with this presentation." "Get her out of my trauma bay," Rowe said. He still didn't look up. 2 people looked at Emma. One of the nurses, a man named Patrick, who'd worked the ER for 11 years, met her eyes for half a second. That half second said everything. He agreed with her, and he wasn't going to say so. A hand touched her elbow. One of the residents, following instructions, steering her gently but unmistakably toward the door. "I'll be right outside," she said to the room, to no one in particular. The door closed. She stood in the hallway outside Trauma 1 with her hand flat against the wall and watched through the narrow vertical window as Rowe's team worked. She could see the monitor from where she stood. The blood pressure was 58/32. The heart rate was 128. She watched them set up for intubation. Her jaw tightened. Inside, she had a very clear picture of what was happening to that man on the table. A picture that had nothing to do with textbooks and everything to do with the specific visceral education of having seen it before. Not in a hospital, somewhere else, somewhere she didn't talk about. The laryngoscope went in. The BP on the monitor dropped to 50. Then the alarm changed pitch. The rapid beeping she'd been hearing shifted into the sustained, flat shriek of a systole. The room erupted. Oh. She was already opening the door when the code alarm triggered overhead. Nobody stopped her. In a code, nobody has time to maintain jurisdictional arguments about who belongs in the room. Emma went straight to the right side of the chest. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain. She grabbed the equipment she needed from the crash cart, 14-gauge needle, long enough, and she found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and she went in. The release of air was immediate, audible. A hiss that, if you knew what it meant, was one of the more relieving sounds in medicine. The blood pressure came back in under 90 seconds. First 50, then 60, then climbing. The cardiac monitor returned from flatline to sinus rhythm, fast but organized. The patient's color shifted. He pulled in a breath that was visible from across the room. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. "He's back," someone said. "Pressure's 82, coming up." Emma stepped back from the gurney. She pulled the gloves off. She set them on the edge of the cart without ceremony and looked at the monitor until she was satisfied with what she saw. Rose stood at the head of the bed. He hadn't moved during the decompression. She didn't know if that was shock or something else. "Good," she said quietly. mostly to herself. He's going to need a chest tube. Then she looked up and found Roe watching her. His face had passed through several expressions in rapid succession and had arrived at the one she'd expected. Not gratitude, not relief, not even professional acknowledgement. His face had landed on fury. "Out," he said. "He needs a chest tube placed before. I know what he needs." His voice was controlled in a way that was more threatening than shouting. "I want you out of this room, and I want your badge at the nursing station, and I want to never see you in my department again. Do you understand me?" "Doctor, Roe, you inserted a needle into a patient without my authorization. That is an unauthorized procedure. That is grounds for immediate termination and potentially licensure review." He turned to the room, nurses, residents, the RT, everyone. "Someone call security, and someone get me the charge nurse." Emma looked at the patient. His eyes were open now, more alert than they'd been. He was looking at her, just looking. She didn't know if he understood what had just happened. She turned and walked out of the room. The next 20 minutes happened in a kind of controlled public humiliation that Emma had not experienced since a different life, in a different context, doing a different kind of work. She stood at the nursing station while Rose spoke to the charge nurse, while the charge nurse looked at Emma with an expression that mixed sympathy and exhaustion, while two security guards materialized at the edges of the conversation in that way security guards did, close enough to act, far enough to pretend they weren't there. Patrick, the nurse who'd been in the trauma bay, slipped past her at one point and pressed his hand briefly against her shoulder without saying anything. That was the entirety of the support she received. Rose's words were precise and loud enough to be heard by anyone within 20 feet of the station, which included 2 residents, a PCT, a paramedic waiting on a signature, and a family member who had been looking for information about their son and had gotten considerably more than they bargained for. She performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a critically ill patient. She ignored direct orders from the attending physician. She has a history of insubordination. She has a documented pattern of overstepping. "I have never been written up," Emma said. "Emma," the charge nurse said quietly. "I have never been written up," she repeated, not louder, not angrier, just accurate. "And I am not going to have a nurse who thinks her judgment supersedes mine working in my department." He turned to the charge nurse. "This is not a discussion. Process her out." The charge nurse, a woman named Olasubomi, who had managed emergency departments for 19 years and had seen every version of this kind of conflict, looked at Emma with something in her eyes that was not entirely devoid of regret. "Emma," she said, "I need you to surrender your badge." Emma unclipped her badge from her scrub pocket. She set it on the desk. "Your personal items from your locker," Olasubomi continued. "Security will escort you." "I know where my locker is," Emma said. They let her walk herself. One of the guards followed at a discreet distance. She went down the hallway to the staff locker area, opened her locker, and looked at what was inside. A change of clothes she kept for long shifts, a phone charger, a worn paperback novel she'd been carrying around for 2 months and hadn't opened in 6 weeks, a small photograph tucked into the back wall of the locker, faded, creased at the corners, a group of people in a landscape that was very clearly not a hospital. She took the photograph. She left everything else. She found an empty cardboard box from the supply area, put the photograph in it, and walked back through the department. The overhead lights buzzed. The monitors beeped in their various rhythms. Someone was crying in Bay 8. Someone else was arguing on the phone in the dictation room. The ER kept moving. It always did. Roe was near the nursing station when she passed, and he said nothing. He was already talking to a resident about something else. She was already not there. The automatic doors at the ambulance bay opened when she approached. Outside, it was raining. A thin, persistent rain that was just cold enough to be unpleasant without being dramatic. She crossed the threshold. The doors closed behind her. The parking lot outside the ambulance bay was lit by a row of pole lights that turned everything orange and flat. Emma walked slowly. She had no umbrella and didn't look for one. The rain hit her hair and her shoulders, and she let it because there didn't seem to be much point in the alternative. She had her car keys in her jacket pocket. Her car was in Staff Lot B, a 3-minute walk. She knew the path without thinking about it. She'd walked it hundreds of times, in every kind of weather, at every hour of the day and night. She was halfway through the lot when she realized she could still hear the hospital behind her. Not the general sounds of it, the ambient noise of a building that never stopped. Something more specific. The rhythm of equipment through exterior walls. A monitor's alarm carrying through the emergency bay doors that were slightly ajar. She slowed. The alarm pattern changed. She knew that changed the way she knew her own heartbeat. That specific escalation, the way a deteriorating rhythm sounded on a monitor, how it moved from warning to crisis in a particular sequence. The chest tube. He still needed the chest tube. Decompression bought time. It didn't solve it. She stood in the rain with her cardboard box and her keys and her coat getting heavier as it absorbed water, and she did not move for a moment that stretched out longer than it should have. Through the glass doors at the far end of the ambulance bay, the ones that looked directly into the corridor outside Trauma 1, she could see figures moving fast. Running, actually. And above the exterior wall, through the gap in the bay doors, she heard the monitor shift into that flat, sustained note. The soldier was crashing again. Emma turned around. She looked at the doors, then at her box, then at the doors again. She set the box down on the pavement in the rain and walked back toward the hospital. She didn't run. Running would have drawn attention, and attention right now was the last thing she needed. She was a terminated employee walking back into a hospital that had just removed her, and the security guards at the ambulance bay entrance were going to notice her before she made it 10 feet past the threshold. She needed a different door. Emma circled left, away from the ambulance bay, following the exterior wall of the building through the rain. There was a secondary entrance on the south side, a staff access door that required a badge to open. Her badge was gone, but she knew that door had been on the maintenance schedule for 2 weeks, that the magnetic seal on the latch had been failing intermittently, that the facilities team had been putting off the repair because they were short a technician. She pushed it. It opened. She walked in without breaking stride into the service corridor that ran parallel to the main ER hallway. The fluorescent lights in here were older, one of them flickering at irregular intervals. The sound of the hospital was different from this side, mechanical, unfiltered, the actual noise of a building running at full capacity rather than the managed version the patients and families heard. She could hear the alarm from Trauma 1 clearly now. She moved. The service corridor connected to the main hallway through a supply access point, not a door that most people used, but a door that existed for exactly the kind of logistics that hospitals couldn't afford to interrupt. She pushed through it and came out 12 feet from the entrance to Trauma 1, and she was already moving before she'd finished processing what she saw. Roe was at the head of the bed. His hands were moving, but his face had the expression of someone who had realized, recently and unwillingly, that the situation had exceeded his model of it. 2 residents were crowded at the equipment tray. The RT was adjusting ventilator settings. The nurse, not Patrick, a different one, was pushing fluids that weren't going to fix the underlying problem. Emma looked at the patient. His color was wrong again. The chest tube tray was on the cart, opened but unused. She walked in. "What are you doing?" one of the residents started. "Chest tube," she said. "Did anyone place it?" Silence. Enough silence to answer the question. Roe turned. When he saw her, something moved across his face that she didn't have time to interpret. "You are not authorized to be in this hospital. Security?" His pressure is dropping because the pneumothorax reaccumulated. She was already at the equipment tray, already checking the tube size. "The needle decompression is temporary. You know that. You've known that since I walked out. Do not touch that patient." "Then you do it." She turned and looked at him directly. "Right now. Mid-axillary 5th intercostal space. If you've done it, you know where to go. I'll stand here and watch." The monitor shrieked again. The BP dropped below 50. Nobody moved. Emma looked at the patient. She looked at the room. She looked at Roe. "Someone is going to do this," she said quietly, "or he's going to die." She picked up the tube. Roe didn't stop her. That fact would matter later, in ways neither of them could anticipate yet, but in the moment it registered as nothing more than an absence of his hand on her arm, an absence of his voice, an absence of the authority he'd been wielding 40 minutes ago with complete confidence. It had just evaporated. She didn't have time to think about why. She worked fast and without ceremony. The technique was automatic, the kind of procedural memory that doesn't live in the conscious mind, that bypasses thought entirely and operates through the hands. Lidocaine, incision, blunt dissection, tube placement. The chest tube went in. She connected it to the drainage system. The pressure equalized. Blood pressure returned slower this time because he'd been down longer, but it returned. She stepped back from the gurney. The room was quieter than it had been in 20 minutes. The monitor showed a rhythm that was sustainable. The patient was breathing visibly, his chest rising in a way that was bilaterally equal for the first time since he'd come through the doors. Emma pulled off her gloves. She was aware, distantly, that her coat was still damp from the rain. That she wasn't wearing gloves when she'd first come in. She'd grabbed them from the box on the cart. That she was standing in a room she'd been formally removed from, in a hospital she no longer had authorization to enter, having performed a second invasive procedure on a patient who was not her patient. She was also aware that none of that mattered as much as the monitor reading 88 systolic and climbing. "He needs imaging," she said to the room. "CT, chest, and abdomen, and someone should call his commanding officer. There was military insignia on his uniform. Someone needs to notify his chain of command." She looked at Roe. He looked back at her. His face was doing something complicated. She couldn't tell if it was anger or humiliation or some combination of the two that didn't have a name. He opened his mouth, and whatever he was about to say, Emma never found out, because the patient moved. Not much. A hand, lifting slightly from the gurney, his eyes opening more fully than they had since he'd arrived. His gaze moved around the room in the unfocused way of someone returning to consciousness and trying to build a picture from fragments. His eyes found Emma. She didn't say anything. She just nodded once, the small nod of one professional to another. "I see you. You're going to be okay. That's all this is." He made a sound, not words, an exhale that had a quality to it, something between relief and recognition. "Okay," Emma said quietly. She stepped away from the gurney. "He's stable. He needs the CT." Then she walked out. She retrieved her cardboard box from the parking lot. The rain had let up slightly, reduced to a mist that hung in the orange light of the lot lamps. The box was wet at the bottom. The photograph inside was fine. She'd put it face down and the cardboard had absorbed the moisture before it could reach the image. She sat in her car and didn't start it for a few minutes. Her hands were steady, which was something she'd learned not to take for granted. There had been years in her life when her hands had not been steady in the aftermath of things like this. Not for any reason she'd chosen, just as a physiological fact, adrenaline doing its job longer than she wanted it to. The steadiness now was a different thing. Harder won. She wasn't sure it was better exactly, but it was what she had. She started the car. She had an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital, a lease she paid month to month because she'd never been certain she'd stay, a refrigerator that currently contained leftover rice, a container of yogurt, and a lime that had been there for 3 weeks. She had a savings account that could cover 6 months if she was careful. She had no idea what she was going to do next. She put the car in reverse. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She ignored it. It buzzed again before she'd made it out of the parking lot. Same number. She stopped at the exit, looked at the screen. The number had a prefix she recognized, a specific area code, a routing pattern she'd last seen on a phone that was issued rather than purchased. She stared at it for a moment. She answered, "Emma Vasquez." Not a question. A statement, read from something. She didn't recognize the voice. Male, measured, the particular flatness of someone trained to deliver information without editorializing. "This is Sergeant Major Douglas Keel, Office of Brigadier General Yates, 7th Special Operations Command. We're attempting to locate Staff Sergeant Aaron Thibodeau, admitted to Harlow General Hospital, approximately—" "He's stable," Emma said. "He was in tension pneumothorax. He's been decompressed and tubed. He needs imaging, but he was hemodynamically improving when I left him." A pause. "You're the nurse who treated him?" "I was the nurse who treated him, yes." "Were you—" Another pause, this one different in texture. "Are you still at the facility?" She looked at the hospital through her windshield. From the parking lot exit, she could see the ambulance bay, the lit windows of the ER, the upper floors going dark at the edges as the pre-dawn city started to wake up. "No," she said. "Ma'am, Brigadier General Yates has requested a briefing on Sergeant Thibodeau's condition and treatment. I've been authorized to ask if you would be willing to remain available for that conversation." "I'm not currently employed by the hospital," Emma said, "as of about 40 minutes ago." Another pause, longer. "I understand. Can I ask, are you medically trained beyond nursing?" She looked at the photograph on the passenger seat, the cardboard box, the wet bottom of it where the rain had soaked through. "I have some background," she said. Ding. She didn't go home. She told herself she was going to, but she ended up parked at the all-night diner 2 blocks from the hospital that the ER staff used for late-night meals and post-shift decompression. It was called Rena's, which was not the owner's name, and it had booths with cracked vinyl seats and a coffee that was reliably strong and nothing else about it that was remarkable. Emma had eaten there probably 300 times in the 2 years she'd been at Harlow General. She ordered eggs and didn't eat them and sat with her coffee and looked out the window at the gray February morning starting to assemble itself outside. She thought about Aaron Thibodeau. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he came back around. That particular look, the one she'd seen before in other contexts, in other rooms that had nothing to do with hospital walls. The look of someone who has just crossed a line between alive and not and knows it, and knows who pulled them back. She thought about Rose's face when she'd walked back in, the absence of movement from him when she'd picked up the chest tube. She'd expected to be physically removed. She'd been prepared for it, had calculated that if she could get the tube in before they grabbed her, it would matter more than anything else. He hadn't moved. None of them had. She didn't know what to do with that yet. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from the same number. "General Yates will arrive at Harlow General at 0600. Your presence has been requested. This is voluntary." Emma looked at the time on her phone. It was 5:18 a.m. She drank her coffee. She thought about it. The eggs went cold in front of her. She left cash on the table and went back to the hospital. Oh, the staff parking lot was more crowded than it had been an hour ago. Day shift was starting to arrive, cars pulling in steadily now, people moving through the cold with their bags and their travel mugs. Emma parked in the visitor lot this time. She sat in the car and watched the building. At 5:47, 2 vehicles she did not recognize pulled into the ambulance bay access road. Not ambulances. Black SUVs, the kind with government plates that were meant to blend in and didn't exactly. They parked without drama. Several people got out. One of them was not in civilian clothes. Emma watched from the visitor lot as the group moved toward the hospital entrance. The person in uniform was a woman, older, straight-backed, moving with the contained energy of someone for whom urgency was a permanent state rather than a response to circumstances. She watched them go inside. She waited 3 minutes, then she got out of her car and walked toward the entrance. The lobby of Harlow General at 5:50 in the morning had a particular quality. The overnight staff winding down, the day staff arriving but not yet at full capacity, a population of patients and families who had been there long enough to stop noticing the lights. The front desk had a single administrator, a man named Terrence, who had been at that desk since midnight and was approximately 4 minutes from the end of his shift. Emma walked past the front desk, past Terrence, past the overnight administrator who was briefing her replacement by the elevator bank. She walked toward the ER. A hand caught her elbow. Not aggressively, firmly. She turned. The man was in his 40s, short-haired, wearing civilian clothes that sat on him the way civilian clothes sit on people who mostly don't wear them. His jacket had a slight bulk at the left hip that she recognized. "Emma Vasquez?" he said. "Yes." "Sergeant Major Keel. We spoke on the phone." He extended his other hand, which she shook. "The general would like to speak with you. She's with the hospital administrator right now. 5 minutes, maybe less. Would you wait?" Emma looked at him. "In what capacity?" "Regarding Sergeant Thibodeau's care." "I'm not an employee here anymore." "I'm aware," Keel said. "The general is also aware. It's not in a professional capacity." Emma said nothing for a moment. Then she nodded. He led her to a small conference room off the main lobby. The kind of room that existed in hospitals for conversations that couldn't happen in hallways, bad news, and insurance discussions, and the occasional administrative dispute. 3 chairs, a table, a whiteboard, with something someone had written and not fully erased. She sat in the chair nearest the door out of habit and waited. She could hear activity in the corridor outside. Voices she didn't know, and at least one she did. The hospital administrator, a man named Pelham, who ran the facility with the energy of someone perpetually managing a controlled disaster. His voice through the wall had the particular tone of someone being very carefully agreeable. The door opened. Brigadier General Nora Yates was 53 years old and looked it in the specific way that people look their age when they have earned every year of it. Her hair was cut close and gray at the temples. Her uniform was precise. She walked into the room the way she had clearly walked into every room for the last 3 decades, assessing it in the first 2 seconds, determining the geometry of the situation, deciding on her position. She sat across from Emma. She didn't bring Keel in. She closed the door herself. She looked at Emma for a moment without speaking. "Thibodeau is stable," she said finally. CT showed no other significant injuries. "They're moving him to ICU for monitoring." "Good," Emma said. "The attending physician, Dr. Rowe, has provided the hospital administrator with his account of last night's events." She paused, in the way of someone who has more to say about something and is choosing the order carefully. "His account and the accounts of the staff present are not entirely consistent with each other." "I would imagine not." Yates studied her. "I pulled your personnel file from Harlow General, your hire date, your performance record, your credentials." She paused again. "Your listed background. Combat Lifesaver certification from a community training program, it says. Civilian paramedic credential. Let it lapse in 2019, Emma said, before your time at this hospital." "Yes. That's what's in the file," Yates said. "That's what you gave them." The room was quiet. The whiteboard, the half-erased writing that said something about quarterly review, and a date that had already passed. "Sergeant Major Keel told me you said you had some background," Yates said. When he asked, Emma looked at the table. "Ms. Vasquez," Yates said, and her voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but different, less procedural. "Aaron Thibodeau has been under my command for 6 years. He is one of the best operators I have. When I got the call that he was in a level 2 trauma center with a tension pneumothorax that the attending physician had missed, and that the trauma bay nurse on her way out the door had caught." She stopped. Something moved in her face. "I want to understand who you are. That's what I'm here for." Emma was quiet for a long moment. The sound of the hospital moved around them. The systemic noise of the building, the PA system in the distance, footsteps in the corridor, the mechanical undertone of everything running. "Is this a formal inquiry?" Emma asked. "No. Are you going to share whatever I tell you with the hospital administration?" Yates looked at her steadily. "Not without your knowledge." Emma looked at the table again, at her hands, which were folded on it, still steady. She looked at them for a moment the way she sometimes did, verifying something she couldn't entirely trust. And then she looked back up. "I need you to understand that I left for reasons," she said. "Not because I failed, not because of a performance issue. I left because—" She stopped, started again. "There was an injury, and there were things that happened in connection with that injury that I didn't want to carry in a uniform anymore." Yates didn't react, didn't move, didn't press. "I was a flight medic," Emma said. "Army, deployed 3 times. Mosul, twice. 1 rotation in a place I can't tell you in a room like this without clearance." She paused. "I left as an E7, staff sergeant. I know what tension pneumothorax looks like because I've seen it more times than I can count, in worse conditions than a trauma bay with a full equipment cart. I know what it sounds like. I know what the trachea does. I know how long you have." She said all of it flatly, without drama. Just facts. "I came here," she said. "Took a nursing credential because it was what transferred. Took this job because it was a job. I wasn't hiding. A beat. I just wasn't advertising." Yates was quiet for a moment. "Your discharge," she said. Honorable? Yes. Decorations? Emma didn't answer immediately. Then, some. Yates nodded once, as though something had been confirmed rather than learned. Emma, she said, first name deliberate. The physician who fired you performed an incorrect assessment on a critically injured member of my command. His errors very nearly killed Sergeant Thibodeau twice. You intervened on both occasions, from outside the building, without authorization, without equipment, and without a position to lose at that point. She folded her hands on the table, mirroring, without seeming to notice it, Emma's posture. I want to know if you're willing to make a formal statement to that effect. Emma felt something shift in her chest. Not a big thing. Not relief, not vindication. Something smaller and more complicated than that. Something adjacent to the feeling of having been seen by someone who actually knew what they were looking at. For what purpose? Emma asked. For several purposes, Yates said, some of which will become clear in the next few hours. The next few hours. Emma would think about those words later and find them funny in a grim, retrospective way. The remarkable understatement of them, the way they smoothed over what was actually coming. The next few hours turned out to be the kind of time that restructured everything that came after it, the kind that you couldn't see the shape of while you were inside it. It started with the hospital administrator. Pelham had been building toward a conversation with Emma since the moment Yates's team had arrived. She could see it in the way he kept appearing at the edges of the spaces she moved through, the conference room doorway, the far end of the ER corridor when she went to check on something for Keel, the lobby when she walked through it a second time at 6:30 in the morning. He was a man who wanted to control a situation and was discovering he had less control than he'd assumed when he'd woken up that morning. He caught up with her near the elevator bank at 6:45. Oops, Vasquez, he said, I understand you've been speaking with Brigadier General Yates. I have. As you know, your employment here ended earlier this morning, which means... I know what it means. Which means your presence in clinical areas is technically... I've been in the lobby and a conference room, she said, not clinical areas. Pelham was a man who prided himself on his composure, and it was visible. The way he managed his face, kept his voice modulated, made careful choices about his words. He had the look of someone who had run hospitals for long enough to believe that most problems could be contained if you got to them early enough with the right language. There are some concerns, he said, about the events in Trauma 1 this morning. Dr. Rowe has filed a formal complaint indicating that an unauthorized individual performed invasive procedures. The patient is alive, Emma said. That's not in dispute. Then what's in dispute? Pelham paused. The manner in which care was delivered. Emma looked at him. She kept her voice very even. The manner in which care was delivered is the only reason Aaron Thibodeau is in the ICU and not the morgue. If you'd like to put that in your formal complaint, I'd encourage you to include it. Something happened in Pelham's face. Not much. A small recalibration. I'm not here to argue with you, he said. I know you're not, she said, because there's nothing to argue. She stepped past him toward the conference room where Yates was waiting, and she heard him say her name once, quietly, in the tone of someone who knows they've lost the ground they were standing on and isn't sure yet which way to fall. At 7:15 in the morning, General Yates made a phone call that Emma was not present for, but whose effect she felt in the changed quality of the air when Yates walked back into the conference room afterward. Something had been set in motion. You could tell by the way Keel was standing near the door, and by the way Yates sat down and placed her phone on the table face down in the manner of someone who has said what needed saying and is now waiting for the machinery to move. I've spoken with JAG and with the hospital's legal office, Yates said. There will be a formal review of Sergeant Thibodeau's care, Dr. Rowe's conduct during the incident, his decision-making, and his subsequent actions regarding your termination will all be part of that review. How long does that take? Emma asked. It depends on what the review finds. Yates looked at her steadily. It could be fast. Emma nodded. In the meantime, Yates said, I want to ask you something that's outside the scope of the formal process. Emma waited. When Thibodeau woke up in the trauma bay, Yates said, before you left, Did he say anything to you? Emma thought about it, the hand moving, the eyes, the exhale. No, she said. He looked at me. That was all. Yates nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something. He knew, she said. It wasn't a question. Knew what? That you knew what you were doing. Yates was quiet for a moment. Thibodeau has been in bad rooms before. He knows the difference between someone working a protocol and someone who has been there. She paused. He's been asking about you since he came fully conscious. 20 minutes ago, when I went to see him. First thing he said. Emma didn't respond to that. She looked at the half-erased whiteboard. He wanted to know if you were all right, Yates said. I told him I was working on it. The PA system crackled in the hallway outside. A nurse's voice, calm and professional, calling something about a room number. Emma looked at her hands again. She had spent 2 years in this hospital being looked through, being corrected in front of people who had less experience than she did, being assigned the most unremarkable work, and never arguing about it, because she'd decided when she took the job that invisible was what she wanted, that quiet was what she'd earned, that there was a difference between the person she'd been and the person she was here, and that difference was something she was entitled to maintain. And then Aaron Thibodeau had come through the door in a bad way, and the difference had stopped mattering. She was thinking about that, turning it over, trying to find the edges of it. When the door to the conference room opened without a knock, it was Patrick, the nurse from the trauma bay. He was still in his scrubs, 12-hour shift winding down, and he looked like a man who had decided to do something he'd been debating for 2 hours and didn't want to give himself more time to talk himself out of it. He looked at Emma, then at Yates, then back at Emma. I need to give a statement, he said, about what happened in that room, both times. He shifted his weight, all of it. Yates looked at him calmly. Sergeant Major Keel can take your statement. Patrick nodded. He looked at Emma again, and in his face was the thing she'd seen earlier in the trauma bay. That half-second of agreement, the one he'd swallowed because the room was Rose's room, and those were Rose's rules, and Patrick had a mortgage and 2 kids and a job he needed to keep. For what it's worth, he said to her, I knew, before you came back in. I knew you were right. Emma held his gaze. She didn't say I know, and she didn't say it's fine, because neither of those things was entirely true. Thank you, she said instead. Just that. Patrick nodded once and left to find Keel. Yates watched the door close. There will be others, she said quietly. There always are once one person moves. Emma thought that was probably true. She also knew that the first person was always the one who mattered, not because the others didn't count, but because the first one was the one who did it when there was still something to lose. Patrick had a mortgage. He had kids. He'd come in anyway. She was still sitting with that thought when Keel appeared in the doorway, and the expression on his face was different from before, more contained, more deliberate, the face of someone delivering information he'd been told to deliver and has decided exactly how. General, he said, Hospital Legal Counsel has just been on with us. They've received a request from Dr. Rowe's attorney. Yates looked at him. He's claiming that Ms. Vasquez was operating under false pretenses, that her employment credentials misrepresented her background. He's arguing it creates liability for the hospital, and that any statement she gives should be considered in that context. Keel paused. He's also requesting access to her personnel file. Emma felt something cold move through her. Not fear. Something more specific than fear. The particular sensation of watching a move you'd known was coming and being unable to entirely prepare for it anyway. Rowe was building a wall, not out of the truth of what had happened, but out of the edges of the truth. The things she'd left out of her file, the credentials she hadn't listed, the history she'd buried under 2 years of quiet shifts and granola bars and overwritten charts. He was going to use what she'd hidden to make the story about her. Yates was watching her, reading her face with the precision of someone practiced at it. Emma, she said. Emma looked up. What's in your personnel file? Yates said. And what's in your actual record? How far apart are those two things? Emma looked at her. The whiteboard. The cracked vinyl chair across from her. The box with the photograph in it, sitting on the table between them. She reached out and turned the photograph over. It was a group. 8 people, standing in landscape that was rocky and hot, and very clearly not the continental United States. All of them in field gear. Emma, in the center left, a few years younger, but recognizable. The same jaw, the same stillness in the posture and across her chest, the configuration of a medic. She pushed it toward Yates. Yates looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. "How far apart?" Emma said. "Pretty far." The hallway outside the conference room was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere deeper in the hospital, from a direction that didn't correspond to the ER or the ICU or any of the clinical areas Emma knew, from the direction of the main entrance and the ambulance drive, came a sound. Not one vehicle, several. And something else beneath the engine noise. A rhythmic, heavy percussion coming from above the building. Yates looked up at the ceiling, then at Keel. Keel had his phone to his ear. He listened for 3 seconds, looked at Yates. "Ma'am," he said, "General Harlan's convoy just pulled off the interstate. ETA 6 minutes." Yates's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. A straightening, almost imperceptible. He came himself. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Emma asked. Yates looked at her across the table, across the photograph. "Because Sergeant Thibodeau isn't the only reason we know your name," she said. The sound got louder before it resolved into anything recognizable. Emma had been in enough operational environments to know the difference between a helicopter passing overhead and one that was descending with purpose. The vibration that moved through the conference room walls was the second kind, the kind that meant something was landing close and landing with intention. Keel was already on his feet. Yates hadn't moved, but her eyes had shifted to the window and then back to Emma, and there was something in that sequence, the look outward, the look back, that carried information Emma couldn't yet fully read. "How many vehicles?" Yates asked Keel. "4 in the convoy, plus the bird." He was still on his phone. "He's got Hollis with him." Yates absorbed that. "Of course he does." "Who is Hollis?" Emma asked. Yates looked at her. The look was not unkind, but it was the look of someone deciding how much to give and in what order. "Colonel Diane Hollis, JAG. She doesn't travel with General Harlan unless something is already past the preliminary stage." Emma processed that. "What stage is it at?" "I don't know yet." Yates stood, straightening her uniform in a gesture that was both practical and, Emma thought, something like preparation. But Harlan doesn't move this fast for a single soldier in a level 2 trauma center, not even one of mine. The implication sat in the air between them. "You said Thibodeau isn't the only reason you know my name," Emma said. Yates looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up the photograph from the table and held it. Not studying it. She'd already studied it, holding it as a kind of punctuation. "Do you know what the Kelvar Valley incident is?" she asked. The room temperature didn't change. The PA system moved in the hallway. A cart rolled past the door with a sound like small thunder. Emma knew what the Kelvar Valley incident was. She knew it the way you know the shape of a scar, not by looking at it, but by the way the surrounding tissue had organized itself around an absence. "That's not something I discuss," she said. "I know," Yates said. "That's part of why we're here." The convoy arrived at 7:34 a.m. Emma heard it rather than saw it. The shift in the lobby sound, the front desk administrator's voice rising slightly, the particular quality of movement that a group of people with authority produces when they enter a civilian space, purposeful and slightly too fast for the setting. Keel went to meet them. Yates told Emma to stay in the conference room and said it in a way that was a request and an instruction simultaneously, which Emma noted and complied with because she had no particular reason not to. She sat back in the chair by the door, and she looked at the table, and she was aware of herself sitting very still in the way she sometimes got when something large was moving toward her. Not frozen, not afraid, just very present. Taking inventory. Checking what she had. What she had. Wet coat, dry hands, a photograph, a cardboard box, no badge, no job, no professional standing in this building whatsoever. A formal statement she'd agreed to give and hadn't given yet. A question Yates had not fully answered hanging in the air. A name she hadn't said out loud in 2 years. The conference room door opened at 7:41. General Raymond Harlan was 60 years old, built like someone who had been powerful at 40 and had converted that into something more economical with time. His hair was white at the temples and cropped close everywhere else. His uniform had the specific immaculateness of a man who had people whose job it was to maintain that immaculateness, and who was also the kind of person who would have maintained it himself if that hadn't been the case. He walked into the room the way Yates had, assessing it in 2 seconds, but differently from Yates, with something more like acquisition. Behind him came a woman in uniform who had to be Hollis, shorter, 30s, a legal pad under one arm, and the particular alertness of someone who had been processing information at high speed for the last 90 minutes and had not stopped. Harlan stopped when he saw Emma. He studied her in a way that was direct and unselfconscious, and would have been rude if it had been casual, but it wasn't casual. It was the look of someone checking a thing they had expected against a thing that was actually there. "Emma Vasquez," he said. "Yes, sir," she said, automatically, and then caught it. The sir, the posture, the slight straightening. Muscle memory running ahead of intention. Something in his expression registered that. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Hollis took the chair to his left. Yates stood near the window. "I'm going to be direct with you," Harlan said, "because I think that's what this situation calls for, and because I understand it's how you prefer things." "How would you know how I prefer things?" Emma asked. "I've spoken with 3 people who served with you," he said, "in the last 2 hours. Emma went still. "Captain Del Rey, Warrant Officer Abubakar, and Sergeant First Class Tremblay, who is currently attached to Bragg, and who I woke up at 0430 to ask about a flight medic named Vasquez, who had apparently just saved one of my operators' lives in a civilian trauma center in Denton City." He paused. Tremblay's words specifically were, and I'm quoting, "If Vasquez says he needs a chest tube, put in a chest tube. She doesn't guess." The room was very quiet. "I know who you are," Harlan said. "I know what you did at Kelvar Valley. I know why you left, and I know that the leaving was not your first choice." He folded his hands on the table, not mirroring her, a different posture entirely, the posture of someone laying cards down. "I also know that Dr. Marcus Rowe terminated your employment this morning and that his attorney is currently attempting to use your file to construct a narrative in which you were operating fraudulently in this hospital." Emma kept her face even. "What I want to know," Harlan said, "is what you want." She looked at him. "What I want?" "Yes." "In relation to what specifically?" "In relation to all of it." He gestured, not expansively, just a small movement of the hand that indicated the general situation. "Rowe, the hospital, what happened to Thibodeau, and what happened to you 4 years ago in a valley in a place we won't name in this room." He paused. "Because what I want, what this office wants, may involve your participation, and I'm not interested in asking for that participation without telling you what it would mean." Emma looked at Hollis. Hollis was watching her with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes. "What would it mean?" Emma asked. Harlan looked at Hollis, who opened her legal pad. "In the next 72 hours, Hollis said, JAG will be filing a formal complaint with the State Medical Board regarding Dr. Rowe's conduct this morning. That complaint will include the accounts of everyone present in that trauma bay, witness statements from nursing staff, and the clinical record." She turned to Paige. "The hospital's legal team has already been in contact with ours. They're concerned about liability. Pelham is concerned about liability. Rowe has an attorney who is more concerned about momentum." She looked up from the pad. "The attorney's argument, the fraudulent credentials argument, lives or dies based on what's actually in your background versus what was in your file. If your background is what General Harlan believes it is, that argument doesn't just fail. It collapses and takes a significant amount of Rowe's remaining credibility with it." "And if I confirm my background," Emma said slowly, "the file discrepancy becomes public." "Yes." "Which means I'm acknowledging that I misrepresented my credentials when I was hired." "Technically, you underrepresented them," Hollis said. "There is a legal distinction." "Is there a practical distinction?" Hollis paused. "Less of one." Emma looked at the table, at the photograph still lying between them, at her own hands. She had built the quiet carefully. 2 years of it. She'd taken a job that asked less than she could give because giving everything had cost her things she couldn't get back. And she'd decided, consciously, on a bad night in a hotel room in a city she'd been passing through, that she was entitled to coast for a while, that she had earned the right to be ordinary. She thought about what it would mean to give that up, not just the quiet, the anonymity, the invisibility she'd worn like a second skin, the not explaining, the scar on her jaw that people had stopped asking about. She thought about Aaron Thibodeau, who had asked about her before he'd asked about anything else. She thought about Marcus Rowe, who had watched her save a man's life and then called his attorney. "What happened at Kelvar Valley?" she said. She said it evenly, without preamble. "You said you know why I left." "I know what's in the record," Harlan said. "I know there was a report, and I know the report's conclusions, and I know that some of what's in that report is accurate, and some of it is—" He stopped, made a careful choice. "Incomplete." "Incomplete," Emma repeated. "There was a decision made at the time," Yates said from the window quietly, "about how to characterize certain events, for operational reasons." Emma looked at her. "You know that," Yates said. "You were there when that decision was made." "I was there when I was told what the decision was going to be," Emma said. "There's a difference." The room absorbed that. Harlan leaned forward slightly. "What happened to you after Kelvar Valley was not a consequence of your performance. It was a consequence of circumstances that certain people chose to manage in a particular way. I'm not going to tell you that was right. I'm telling you that there is now an opportunity to revisit what that record says." He paused. "But I need to understand something first. Are you willing to talk about what actually happened? Not for the hospital, not for Roe. For the record." Emma was quiet for a long moment. The PA system, the cart in the hallway, the muffled sound of the hospital running around the edges of the room. "There were 8 of us," she said. She talked for 22 minutes. She had not talked about this in 4 years. She had given a formal account once, immediately after, to people who had already decided what the account was going to say, and she had signed a document, and she had been told that her service was valued and her sacrifice was noted, and then she had been walked out of a room that looked not entirely unlike this one, and into a life she had subsequently arranged to be as different as possible from the one she'd been living. She talked about the valley. She talked about the convoy, and the IED, and the decision that had to be made in the first 90 seconds about triage. Who could be moved? Who couldn't? Who was going to make it to the casualty collection point if she made the right calls, and who wasn't? She talked about the 3 soldiers she had saved and the one she hadn't, and the reason she hadn't, which was not what the report said the reason was. She talked about the injury to her own shoulder that she'd taped and not mentioned because mentioning it would have pulled her out of the action and there was nobody else to replace her. She talked about what happened after, when the report was being drafted, and what she had been asked to omit, and what omitting it had meant for the account of why Specialist Reyes had not survived. She talked about all of it without raising her voice and without breaking and without performing either of those things. She just said it, flatly and in order, the way you report information when the purpose of reporting is accuracy and not effect. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Hollis's pen had been moving for most of the 22 minutes and had stopped approximately 3 minutes before Emma finished. Harlan sat back in his chair. "Reyes's family," he said. "Was told he died in the initial blast," Emma said. "Which is true. He did. He was not recoverable. But the reason the report said the reason was, I know what the report said." "Then you know it wasn't accurate." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know that." Something shifted in Emma's chest. Not large, not dramatic. The small, specific sensation of a thing being acknowledged that has been unacknowledged for a very long time. "Okay," she said. "What we are going to do," Hollis said, in the voice of someone moving from the emotional register to the operational one, which Emma recognized and was almost grateful for, is this. "I'm going to take a formal statement from you that covers both Kelvar Valley and this morning's events at Harlow General. Those statements serve different processes, but they are connected by your identity, by the file discrepancy, and by the argument Roe's attorney is trying to make." She paused. "Your cooperation with the Kelvar Valley Review will go on record as voluntary and proactive. That matters." "And Roe?" Emma asked. Hollis met her eyes. Dr. Rowe is going to have a difficult several weeks. Emma looked at Harlan. The file discrepancy, she said. My hiring credentials? What happens to that? It's a complicating factor, Hollis said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but context matters enormously in these things. And the context here, a decorated veteran choosing not to advertise her background for personal reasons, working competently for 2 years, making no errors, and ultimately acting decisively to save a patient the attending physician could not help. That context does considerable work. Does it do enough work? Hollis looked at her steadily. With our office behind it, yes. Emma nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then, the photograph. She looked at it on the table. I want it back, she said. Of course, Harlan said. He pushed it toward her. She picked it up. The formal statement took 90 minutes. Hollis ran it with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and had no interest in either rushing it or prolonging it, just completing it accurately, getting every detail placed correctly in the record, noting timestamps and sequences with the care that would make the document defensible in whatever processes it was going to have to survive. Emma answered everything asked. She added things that weren't asked when they were relevant. She corrected 2 things Hollis had written down slightly wrong. She signed the bottom of each page. When it was done, Keel brought coffee that was significantly better than anything the hospital had produced. Emma drank it and felt the last of the morning's adrenaline metabolize out of her system, leaving behind something that was neither good nor bad. Just the particular exhaustion of having operated at high intensity for several hours and come out the other side. Yates came and sat with her while Hollis and Harlan moved to the corridor for a conversation Emma wasn't part of. How are you? Yates asked. Emma thought about answering that honestly and decided to answer it accurately instead, which was different. Tired. A little like I've just handed something over and I'm not sure I'll get it back in the same shape. You won't, Yates said. It'll come back different. Whether different is better depends on what happens next. You're not very reassuring. No, Yates agreed. I'm generally not. Emma looked at her. What do you know about Kelvar Valley? What do you actually know, not what's in the report? Yates was quiet for a moment. I know that Reyes's death was recorded as a tactical outcome, she said carefully. And I know that you were the only medic on site for 11 minutes while the quick reaction force was inbound. And I know that 11 minutes is a long time. She paused. And I know that the people who wrote the report were more concerned with a particular narrative about the operation than with accuracy about the medical decisions made on the ground. Emma looked at the table. You saved 3 people, Yates said, in 11 minutes. With a shoulder injury you didn't report. I didn't save Reyes. No, you couldn't have. The report implies I could have. I know. That implication? Emma stopped, started again. That implication followed me out of service. It's why I'm in Denton City managing chest pain workups and getting fired by Marcus Rowe. Yates let that sit for a moment. It's going to be corrected, she said finally. Emma looked at her. Harlan is... He's not a man who does this lightly, Yates said, coming here personally. Hollis. The pace of all of this. She gestured at the room, at the morning outside. He moves this fast when he's decided something. He's decided that the Kelvar Valley record needs to be corrected. I don't know all his reasons and I'm not going to speculate, but he's decided. Emma thought about that. And in the meantime, she said, what happens when I walk out of this room? In the meantime, Yates said, I would suggest you don't go far down. She was in the lobby at 9:20 a.m. when Marcus Rowe walked in. He was not alone. There was a man in a suit beside him who was clearly the attorney, mid-50s, the confident posture of someone who billed by the hour and knew it, and the hospital's head of HR, a woman named Bernadette Foss, who always wore the expression of someone responsible for other people's messes. Rowe saw Emma the moment he came through the doors. He stopped. Just for a half second, a small interruption in his stride that he recovered from immediately, but Emma caught it. She was watching. She'd been watching the doors since she'd sat down in the lobby chair 20 minutes ago. He continued toward the elevators. His attorney said something close to his ear. Rowe answered without looking at Emma again. She watched him go. She was aware of what she was doing, cataloging him the way she used to catalog things in the field, the way his jaw was set, the slight tension in his shoulders, the attorney's hand on his arm, guiding more than accompanying, the particular quality of a man who has assembled around himself the apparatus of defense and is trusting it to hold. Patrick came through the lobby doors 12 minutes later. He saw Emma and hesitated, then came to sit in the chair beside her. "Roe's attorney got here an hour ago," he said. "He was in with Pelham." "I know." "There are 4 other people ready to give statements." Patrick's voice was level, but she could hear the effort it cost him. "Me and 3 others. About what happened in that room. About the pattern of it. Not just today. Roe has a history of this. Overruling nursing staff, dismissing calls that turned out to be correct. There are documented incidents. People kept their notes." Emma looked at him. "Did someone tell you to come tell me that?" "No," he said. "I'm telling you because you should know it. Because you're sitting here looking like you're calculating odds, and the odds are better than you think." She almost smiled. "I look like that?" "You look like you're waiting to see if the bridge holds," he said. "Which, for what it's worth, I've seen people stand on that bridge, and I'm pretty sure it holds." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. Patrick stood up. He had another shift starting in 2 hours and looked like someone who very much needed sleep before that. He got halfway to the door and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said, "every time Roe overruled you in the last 2 years, every single time, you were right. I never said anything. I should have." He left. Emma sat with that, with the weight of it, the accumulated small moments of being correct and being overruled and saying nothing. 2 years of choosing invisible over right, and all the patients she'd gotten to anyway by working around instead of through. The Gerald Odoms. The people she'd checked on every 30 minutes. The Aaron Thibodeaux she'd reached from the other side of a closed door. She looked at her phone. The photograph was in her coat pocket. The cardboard box was by her feet. She had been in this building for over 4 hours since being fired, and there was a particular absurdity to that fact that she couldn't fully decide what to do with. Her phone showed a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. Not the military routing pattern, something else. She looked at it. She called back. It rang twice. Then, "Ms. Vasquez, this is Bennett Orford. I'm an investigative reporter with the Denton City Register. I've been made aware of an incident at Harlow General this morning involving a military patient and a nurse who was terminated. I'd be interested in speaking with you, if you're willing." Emma looked at the ceiling of the hospital lobby. "Who made you aware of it?" she asked. "I'm not able to share that." "When was that?" A pause. "About 45 minutes ago." Emma thought about who knew about the incident 45 minutes ago and who among those people would have called a reporter. The list was surprisingly short, and at the top of it, wearing a pressed white coat and accompanied by an attorney, was a man who had just walked through this lobby. Roe was running a parallel game. He was building his version of the story, the unauthorized nurse, the fraudulent credentials, the liability, and he was feeding it to the press before anyone else could define the narrative. "I'll call you back," Emma said, and hung up. She stood. She picked up the box. She walked back toward the conference room, and she moved fast because she understood now that the shape of the next several hours had just changed, and that the question was no longer whether the bridge held, but whether she could get everyone to the other side before Roe set fire to it. She pushed open the conference room door. Harlan and Hollis were still there. Yates looked up immediately. "Roe's attorney has contacted a reporter," Emma said. "Denton City Register. The reporter called me 45 minutes after the attorney arrived. He's building the story from his end before your process has time to build anything from yours." Harlan looked at Hollis. "How long before the medical board complaint is formally filed?" he asked. "With the paperwork we have right now? 3 hours. Can it be 1? Hollis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If I skip lunch." "Skip it," he said. She was already on her phone. Emma set the box down. She was still standing in the doorway, and she looked at Harlan, who was looking back at her with an expression that was the closest thing to frank assessment she'd seen from him. "You knew he'd do this," she said. "I suspected he'd do something like this," Harlan said. People who are afraid and have access to lawyers tend to move in predictable directions. So what do we do? Harlan looked at Yates. Yates looked at Emma. We could, Yates said, control what the reporter knows, not suppress it. Just make sure he has the full picture. You want to talk to him, Emma said. I want you to have the option to, Yates said. Your story, your call. Emma stood in the doorway of the conference room in a hospital that had fired her 6 hours ago, holding a wet cardboard box with a photograph in it, being asked by a brigadier general whether she wanted to give a newspaper the version of herself she'd spent 2 years trying not to be. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she took out her phone and called Bennett Orford back. He answered on the first ring. I'll talk to you, Emma said. But not here, and not now. Give me 2 hours and I'll give you everything. But you have to agree to sit on it until I tell you when. A pause. What's the story? The story, Emma said, is that the doctor who fired me this morning almost killed a United States Army soldier. And the reason he almost killed him is the same reason he fired me. And both of those things are connected to something that happened 4 years ago that nobody has talked about yet. She stopped. That's the story. Another pause, longer. 2 hours, Orford said. Emma hung up. She looked at Harlan. I need a favor, she said. He raised an eyebrow. I need someone to get Aaron Thibodeau's permission to include his name, she said. He's the patient. His story is his. I won't use it without asking. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his own phone and called someone and said, in the particular tone of a man giving an instruction that will be immediately executed, Get me Thibodeau. Emma nodded. She sat down. She looked at the whiteboard, the half-erased quarterly review, the date that had already passed. And she thought about what was coming, and she did not pretend to herself that it was going to be simple or clean. Her shoulder ached in the old way. It did that sometimes when she'd been on her feet for a long time, a dull reminder in the joint that had nothing to do with the work she'd done this morning and everything to do with an 11-minute window in a valley 4 years ago. She pressed her hand against it briefly. A habit. It didn't help, and she did it anyway. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved, but with the military routing prefix. A single line. I heard you came back in. Thibodeau. Tell them yes. Emma stared at the screen. She had not given Thibodeau her number. She had not given it to anyone associated with his unit. She did not know how it had gotten to him or how he had reached her with it, and she suspected that if she asked, the answer would be something that would tell her more about what Thibodeau's actual operational capacity was than his current ICU admission suggested. She looked at the text for a long moment. Then Keel opened the door and said, in a voice that was very controlled in the way that voices get controlled when the information being delivered is significant, Ms. Vasquez, there's something you should see. She looked up. The hospital's security footage, he said, from the trauma bay. Both incidents. Someone pulled it at Roe's attorney's request. He paused. But the administration pulled it first, before the attorney could get to it. Emma stood. And? She said. Keel looked at her steadily. It shows everything, he said, all of it, including Roe's attorney walking into the administrator's office 20 minutes ago and asking for the footage to be pulled from the system before anyone could see it. Emma went very still. He asked for it to be destroyed, she said. He asked for it to be reviewed by hospital legal before being shared with any outside party, Keel said, which is technically not the same as asking for it to be destroyed, but the administrator recorded the conversation. He paused. Pelham he's had a long morning. He recorded it. Emma thought about Pelham, the controlled composure of him, the careful agreeableness she'd heard through the conference room wall. The man who managed a controlled disaster every day and had been doing it long enough to know when one disaster was trying to use his facility to contain another. She looked at Keel. What's on that footage? She said slowly. Exactly. Keel looked at Yates. Yates looked at Emma. Enough, Yates said, to make the next 24 hours look very different for Dr. Roe than he thinks they're going to look. Emma stood in the conference room with the old ache in her shoulder and the photograph in her coat pocket. and the weight of a morning that had started at 5:47 in a break room with bad coffee, and she was aware of something building. Not triumphant, not righteous, just the particular clarity that comes when a situation has been moving toward a specific point for a long time and has finally arrived there. Then Hollis walked in with her phone to her ear and her legal pad under her arm, and the expression on her face was not one Emma could read immediately, but it was not the expression of someone carrying good news. "We have a problem," Hollis said. She looked at Emma. "Roe's attorney just filed a civil complaint," she said. "Against you, personally. Unauthorized medical practice. Emotional distress." She paused. "And he's named General Yates as a co-defendant for facilitating your access to the facility." The room went very quiet. Yates stood absolutely still. Emma felt the floor of the situation shift in a way she had not anticipated. Not undermined, not collapsing, but different. Roe had widened the target. He was no longer just building a defense. He was attacking the people who had come to hold him accountable, and he had picked the one that would cost Emma the most, which was not herself. It was Yates. Emma looked at the general. Yates was looking at the wall. Her jaw was set. In her expression was something Emma recognized, not from hospitals or meetings or formal processes, from somewhere older. The specific expression of someone who has been in a fight before and knows that the fight has just changed shape and is deciding whether to change shape with it. She looked at Emma. "Well," she said quietly. Emma picked up her phone. She had 2 hours before Orford needed an answer. She had footage that showed Roe's attorney asking for evidence to be reviewed before it could be seen. She had 4 witness statements, a formal JAG complaint in progress, a Kelvar Valley record that was about to be reopened, and a civil lawsuit that had just been filed against her, and a general who had come to this hospital because one of her soldiers was alive when he might not have been. She also had a text from that soldier on her phone that said, "Tell them yes." She thought about the next step. Not all the steps, just the next one. That was how you moved through the bad terrain, one step at a time. Check the ground. Move. She found Harlan's eyes. "I need to see that footage," she said. The footage was on a laptop Keel had pulled from somewhere, set on the conference room table with the screen angled so that Harlan, Yates, Hollis, and Emma could all see it without crowding. It wasn't dramatic to look at. Security footage rarely was. The timestamp in the corner ran at 7:23 a.m., about 40 minutes after Emma had walked out of the hospital the first time. The camera angle was from the upper corner of the trauma bay, wide enough to capture most of the room. The first clip was the original incident. Emma watched herself work. She had never seen herself from the outside in a clinical context, and it was briefly disorienting. The way she moved, the economy of it, no wasted motion. She watched Roe's back while she was doing the decompression. His stillness. She'd clocked it at the time as shock, but watching it from above and outside, it read differently. It read like a man who understood in real time that he was watching something he should have done and hadn't. Then she watched herself leave. Then the timestamp moved forward. The second clip started. She watched the room deteriorate, the BP on the wall monitor visible in the upper right of the frame dropping, the team movements becoming less coordinated, Roe's hands going still at the head of the bed. She watched the door open when she came back in. She watched Roe not stop her. "There," Hollis said. She pointed at a section of the screen, bottom left, where Roe was standing. "His hands. He takes a half step back." "He made room," Yates said. "Deliberately," Hollis said. "Whatever he says about unauthorized procedure, whatever argument his attorney makes, that footage shows him making a choice not to intervene while she worked, which means on some level he authorized it by inaction." She looked at Harlan. "That substantially complicates his claim." "And the attorney's visit?" Emma asked. Keel moved the track forward. Different camera now. The corridor outside the administrator's office. The timestamp read 9:04 a.m. A man in a suit, the attorney, identifiable by the same jacket Emma had seen in the lobby, walked into frame, knocked on Pelham's door, was admitted. The corridor footage had no audio, but what it showed, 9 minutes later, was the attorney exiting with the particular bearing of someone who had not gotten what he came for. "Pelham recorded the audio," Keel said. He pulled up a second window. A voice memo, time-stamped. He hit play. The attorney's voice was composed and professionally reasonable, which made what he was saying land harder. He used phrases like chain of custody and institutional liability review and protocol for sensitive footage, all of which meant, stripped of the packaging, that he wanted the footage held, reviewed by people of his choosing, and not disseminated to any external party before he'd had the opportunity to determine what it showed. Pelham's voice in response was careful, agreeable, the voice of a man who is managing something. He said yes to everything the attorney said, in the tone of someone who was taking very careful mental notes. He knew, Emma said. He's been doing this for a long time, Yates said. There was something almost like respect in it. Hollis closed the laptop. She had the particular expression of someone whose legal brief has just gotten stronger in a way they'd hoped for but hadn't counted on. The attorney's conversation with Pelham is going into the complaint. Attempted suppression of material evidence in an active institutional review. He'll say it was a standard liability hold, Harlan said. He'll say a lot of things, Hollis replied. That's fine. That's what lawyers do. What he won't be able to say is that the footage doesn't exist, or that what it shows is ambiguous, or that Rowe's subsequent civil filing was made in good faith. She paused. Filing a civil complaint against someone 40 minutes after attempting to suppress footage of your own conduct is not a move that reads well to a review board. Emma looked at the table. The civil filing is still real, she said. Whatever happens to Rowe, I'm still named in a lawsuit. You are, Hollis said, and so is General Yates, which is the part that concerns me more structurally because it creates a conflict in how our office can operate. It doesn't, Yates said. Hollis looked at her. General, I said it doesn't. I came here voluntarily on my own time to check on a soldier under my command. My presence here and anything I did while here is defensible and will be defended. Her voice was flat in the way that indicated no further discussion would be productive. Move on. Hollis moved on. At 10:15, Pelham requested a meeting. He came to the conference room himself, which told Emma something. That he'd made a calculation about where the power in the building currently resided, and it was not in his office. He was a tall man who had the slightly diminished quality of someone who had been managing a crisis since before dawn and was now running on adrenaline and professional obligation. He sat at the end of the table. He looked at Harlan, then at Yates, then at Emma, in the order of institutional hierarchy, and then, she thought, in the order of what he was actually concerned about. I want to be transparent, he said, about the conversation with Dr. Rowe's attorney this morning. We have the recording, Hollis said. Pelham nodded as though he'd expected that. I want to be clear that I did not comply with the request. The footage was preserved, all of it, he paused. I also want to say, formally, that the decision to terminate Ms. Vasquez's employment this morning was made unilaterally by Dr. Rowe. It was not reviewed by HR, it was not approved by administration, and it does not reflect institutional policy. Emma looked at him. You're rescinding the termination. Pelham met her eyes. I'm saying that the process by which it occurred was not procedurally valid, which means it is subject to review. He paused. Which is administrator language for yes. It was so close to a joke that Emma almost responded to it as one. There are also 3 formal complaints filed by nursing staff against Dr. Rowe that were in our HR system prior to this morning, Pelham continued. They were filed over the past 14 months. They were reviewed internally and incorrectly, in retrospect, not escalated. He said this with the careful precision of a man who had already consulted with his own legal team and knew exactly how much to acknowledge and how much to frame. Those complaints will now be part of the review process. 3, Emma said. Not a question. 3 documented. There may be others who chose not to file formally. Patrick's voice in the lobby. Every time Rowe overruled you, you were right. And before that, I should have. Emma thought about all the people who had chosen not to file because the calculation, mortgage, kids, career, the particular institutional gravity of a physician like Rowe in a hospital like this, had told them it wasn't survivable. She thought about 2 years of granola bars and quiet charts and 30-minute check-ins that nobody saw. Thank you, she said to Pelham. He nodded. He looked like a man who was doing the right thing and was aware it was also, fortunately, the operationally correct thing, and was not entirely comfortable with how much those two things aligned. She appreciated that discomfort. It suggested he'd thought about it. He left. Yates looked at Emma. "How are you doing?" "You already asked me that." "You gave me a diplomat's answer." Emma thought about it. "I'm okay," she said. "I'll be better when this is over." "It's not going to be over today." "I know. Or this week." "I know that too." Yates studied her for a moment. "Are you going to stay?" "In Denton City." "At the hospital, if they offer it back?" Emma looked at the whiteboard, the quarterly review, the past date. "I don't know yet," she said. At 11:40, Bennett Orford arrived. He was younger than Emma had expected from his voice. Late 20s, maybe 30, with the slight self-consciousness of someone who knew he was walking into a room where something significant had happened and was trying not to let that show in how he carried himself. He had a recorder and a notebook, and he shook hands with everyone he was introduced to and did not visibly react when Harlan's rank was stated, which suggested either professionalism or genuine composure, and Emma decided provisionally that it was both. She did most of the talking. Yates contributed 2 sentences. Harlan sat in the corner and said nothing, which was itself a form of statement. Emma talked about what had happened in the trauma bay. She talked about Rose's decision-making and his instruction to remove her. She talked about the decompression and the firing and walking back in. She talked about Aaron Thibodeau without saying anything about his operational history or his unit. She said he was an active duty soldier, blast trauma. She had recognized the presentation. She had acted. She talked about Kelvar Valley in careful terms. Not the classified details, not the locations or the operational specifics, but the outline of it. That she had served, that she had been a flight medic, that her service record was more extensive than what she had listed in her hospital personnel file, and that the gap between those two things would be part of a formal review process she was cooperating with. Orford asked good questions. He didn't perform surprise at the answers. He circled back twice to things she'd said to make sure he had them accurately, which she respected. At the end, he looked at her. "Doctor, Rose Attorney's version of this story is that you were practicing medicine without proper authorization, that you put a patient at risk, and that the military's involvement is being used to cover up your liability." "I know what his version is," Emma said. "Can you characterize how you distinguish your version from his?" Emma looked at him steadily. "His patient was alive when I walked out the door. That's my characterization." Orford wrote it down. He left at 12:30 with an agreement to hold the story until Emma gave him clearance. He did not push on the timeline, which told her he was confident enough in what he had that he could afford to wait. The afternoon moved differently from the morning. The crisis pace of the early hours, the constant motion, the information arriving in bursts, the decisions stacking on each other, gave way to something slower and more procedural. Phone calls, documents, Hollis on her laptop drafting and revising, Keel moving in and out of the room with updates delivered in the efficient shorthand of someone reporting to people who didn't need context. At 2:15, Keel reported that the State Medical Board had acknowledged receipt of the JAG complaint. They had opened a preliminary inquiry, which was not a finding, but was not nothing. It meant the complaint had enough substance to warrant formal attention, and that Dr. Rowe's office at the hospital had been formally notified. At 2:50, Keel reported that 2 additional nursing staff had submitted written statements to Hollis's team. One of them had documented a specific incident from 8 months prior in which Rowe had overridden a nursing assessment of a pediatric patient with a respiratory presentation. The child had deteriorated. The outcome had been okay, ultimately, but the documented sequence of events was not flattering to Rowe's judgment. At 3:30, the thing happened that Emma had not predicted. Rowe's attorney called Hollis directly. Hollis took the call in the corridor. She was gone for 11 minutes. When she came back in, she sat down and put her phone on the table and said nothing for a moment in the way of someone organizing information before speaking. "He wants to negotiate," she said. Harlan looked at her. Define negotiate. "He's willing to withdraw the civil complaint against Miss Vasquez and against General Yates. In exchange for, and I'm characterizing this carefully, a mutual agreement not to pursue certain avenues of the review." Emma felt something cold and specific move through her. He wants the medical board inquiry dropped. He wants it. He didn't use that word. He used scoped, limited to the events of this morning. Hollis paused. Specifically, he wants the prior complaints, the prior incidents, the pattern of conduct. He wants those off the table. He can't negotiate the medical board's scope, Harlan said. He knows that. He's negotiating what our office provides to the medical board. The room was quiet. He's scared of the pattern, Emma said. He's terrified of the pattern, Hollis confirmed. One incident this morning is professionally damaging. An established pattern of the same behavior over 14 months, with documented instances and nursing staff willing to testify. That's not a suspension. That's licensure. Emma looked at Harlan. What's your position? I'm not in the business of protecting the careers of physicians who almost killed my soldiers, he said. Then the answer is no, Emma said to Hollis. Hollis nodded. She picked up her phone. That's what I thought. She sent a message, short, typed without looking at the screen, and put the phone back down. 40 seconds later, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and did not answer it. He'll call back, she said, with a different offer. He didn't call back. What happened instead at 4:05 p.m. was that a resignation letter was delivered electronically to Harlow General's administrator from Dr. Marcus Rowe. Keel brought it in on his phone and read it aloud. It was brief. It cited personal reasons and thanked the hospital for 12 years of collaboration. It was the kind of letter that said nothing and therefore said everything, and it arrived 6 hours after Rowe had fired Emma Vasquez in front of the nursing station with enough volume to reach the waiting room. Emma sat with it for a moment. She had not wanted him to resign. That wasn't quite accurate. She hadn't wanted anything specific from him, hadn't been running toward a particular outcome. What she had wanted was for the record to be accurate, for what had happened in the trauma bay to be seen clearly by people with the standing to respond to it. His resignation did not prevent the medical board review. It did not retract the prior complaints. It did not undo the morning or rewrite what the footage showed. It was in the end just a man removing himself from a position he could no longer hold, in the same building where, 9 hours ago, he had stood at a nursing station and told a decorated combat medic to hand over her badge. He pulled the civil filing, Keel said. 10 minutes ago, both names. Yates looked at Emma. Emma looked at the table. She pressed her hand against her shoulder once, briefly. The old ache. She didn't try to explain it to herself. It was just there, the way it always was, and she worked around it, the way she always had. What happens to the medical board inquiry? She asked Hollis. It continues, Hollis said. We don't negotiate scope, and his resignation doesn't close it. The prior complaints are part of the record. The footage is part of the record. She paused. His license is going to be reviewed regardless of where he works next. Emma nodded. And the Kelvar Valley review, she said. Hollis looked at Harlan. That's a longer process, he said. But it's moving. What I can tell you now is that the record as it stands is going to be amended. The characterization of the triage decisions made on the ground is going to be corrected. He paused. Reyes's file is going to be corrected. Emma looked at her hands. She thought about Specialist Reyes's family, what it would mean for them to have the record say what it should have said 4 years ago. She didn't know if it would be enough. Nothing was ever enough for that kind of loss, and she'd stopped expecting it to be. But accuracy mattered. The record mattered. She had believed that for a long time and kept believing it, even when the record said things about her that weren't true. And now the record was going to say something different, and she was trying to understand what to do with the fact that it had taken this specific morning in this specific hospital for that to happen. She didn't have an answer. She filed it away with the other things that didn't have answers yet. There's one more thing, Harlan said. Emma looked up. He had a folder on the table. Physical, paper. She hadn't noticed it before, or it had been there and she'd cataloged it as administrative background. He opened it, slid one page toward her, and said nothing while she read it. It was a program description. Military Emergency Medical Training, Specialized Track, attached to a joint civilian-military hospital network. The program was designed to bridge the gap between combat medical training and civilian hospital environments, not just skills transfer, but protocol development, curriculum building, staff training. It was new. The pilot was launching in 6 months. At the bottom of the page, a single handwritten line in different ink from the rest of the document. We need a program director. Harlan. Emma looked at the page for a long time. She looked at the cardboard box on the floor beside her chair, at the photograph in her coat pocket, at the quarterly review on the whiteboard with the date that had already passed. 6 months, she said. To staff up and design the curriculum, Harlan said. The first cohort would start in September. I'd have to redo my credentialing, officially this time. Yes, and the file discrepancy will be part of the record and will be contextualized by everything else that's part of the record, Hollis said. It will not be an obstacle. Emma set the page down. She thought about it. Not the outcome, but she'd think about the outcome later when she was alone and it was quiet and she had more than 4 hours of sleep behind her. She thought about the shape of the question itself. Whether she wanted to go back to that version of herself, not the version she'd been before Kelvar Valley, that was gone, but the version that had existed inside the uniform, the version that had carried things. She'd thought she was done carrying things. She was beginning to understand that was not entirely a choice she got to make. She was still sitting with all of that when the door opened and Keel came in with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that was different from any look he'd worn during the past 9 hours. Ms. Vasquez, he said. He held out the phone. She took it. On the screen was a text from a hospital extension she didn't recognize. The message was 6 words. He's asking to see you. Room 412. Aaron Thibodeau. ICU had moved him to a monitored step-down room, which meant he was stable enough to have a room number, which meant he was stable enough to ask. Emma looked at the text. She looked at Harlan's handwritten note at the bottom of the program description, still sitting in front of her. She stood up. She left the box. She left the program page. She put the photograph in her pocket and walked out of the conference room, through the lobby, past the front desk where Terrence's replacement looked up and said nothing, to the elevator bank. 4th floor, room 412. She stood outside the door for a moment. Inside, through the small vertical window, she could see a man in a hospital bed, significantly larger than the person a hospital bed was designed to contain, with the specific stillness of someone who had been through something large and had arrived on the other side of it. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling. She pushed the door. He turned his head when she came in. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the trauma bay. That same look, the one that said, I know what just happened, and I know who was responsible for it. Except this time it wasn't weighted with the emergency of the moment. This time it was just clear, steady. Hey, he said. His voice was rough from the tube. Hey, she said. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat beside the bed, and she folded her hands the way she did when she was waiting for something. And she didn't say anything else, and neither did he, for a moment. Then Thibodeau looked at the ceiling again and said quietly, They told me what you did, both times. The second time was just a chest tube, she said. Technically routine. Right. He made a sound that was close to a laugh and wasn't quite. From the parking lot. I hadn't fully left yet. He turned his head to look at her. General Harlan said you're considering the program. Word travels. He told me specifically, I think he wanted me to weigh in. And? Thibodeau looked at her for a moment. He had the face of someone who chose his words deliberately, not because he lacked them, but because he'd learned the cost of the wrong ones. I've had 2 medics save my life, he said. Once in a situation I'm not allowed to describe, and once in a trauma bay in Denton City at 6 a.m. He paused. The one in the situation I can't describe. She was trained the same way you were trained. I think about that a lot. Emma looked at him. I think you know what I'm saying, he said. She did know. She didn't say so out loud because it was one of those things that didn't need to be said to be understood. She looked at the window. Afternoon light, flat, February pale, the kind of light that didn't do much except be present. She was thinking about the program, about the curriculum, about the gap between what the military trained and what civilian hospitals were equipped to receive, and all the Aaron Thibodeaus who moved between those 2 worlds and found the seam between them at the worst possible moment. She was thinking about all of it when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Orford. A text. Someone just sent me documents. Kelvar Valley. I don't know who. I need to talk to you. Now. Emma went still. She read the text twice. Documents, Kelvar Valley. Someone had sent them to a reporter. Not just the outline she'd given him, not the official record, but documents. Which meant internal documents. Which meant someone with access had made a choice, and made it in the last 2 hours, and she had no idea who or why or what the documents said. She stood up. Thibodeau was watching her. I have to go, she said. He nodded. He looked at her face and read whatever was there and didn't ask. She was at the door when he said, Vasquez. She turned. Whatever just happened, he said, whatever that look is, I've seen it before. On people who are about to find out something they weren't expecting. He paused. You're going to handle it. She looked at him for a moment. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't say I know, and she didn't say anything that would make the moment into something it wasn't. She walked out. In the elevator, descending, her phone buzzed again. Orford. A second text, 3 words this time. They include everything. The elevator doors opened and Emma was already dialing. Orford picked up on the second ring. How fast can you get to me? He said, without preamble. 5 minutes. Where are you? Lobby. I came to the hospital. I didn't know where else to go with this. She found him near the front entrance, standing apart from the ambient traffic of the lobby, holding his phone with both hands in the posture of someone who had been looking at something for long enough that he'd stopped being able to see it clearly. He was younger in person than he'd seemed on the phone, and right now he looked younger still. Not frightened, but shaken in the specific way of someone who has received information that has outpaced their framework for understanding it. He handed her the phone without speaking. The documents were photographs, taken with a phone, slightly angled, the edges of a desk visible in one corner. Classified headers, the kind she recognized. Internal communications from the Kelvar Valley operational period. 3 of them. The first was an assessment memo dated 2 weeks after the incident. It laid out, in the flat language of military documentation, the triage decisions made on the ground. It named her. It was accurate. It said clearly and without ambiguity that the decisions made by the flight medic on site were consistent with field triage protocol, and that the outcome for Specialist Reyes was a consequence of injury severity, not medical error. The second document was a revision memo, dated 4 days later. It named the same incident. It said something different. The language had been adjusted. The same facts, restructured to imply a question about response time. Nothing explicit. Just a shift in framing that, in the context of a formal record, changed the weight of what it described. The third document was an email chain between 2 senior officers whose names she did not recognize. It was 5 exchanges long. The last line read, "The revised version protects the operational narrative. Sign off and move." Emma stood in the lobby of Harlow General Hospital and read the email chain 3 times. Then she handed the phone back to Orford. "Who sent these to you?" she said. "Anonymous. Encrypted send. I can't trace it." She thought about who had access to documents at that classification level. The list was not long. She thought about Harlan arriving this morning with Hollis, about the pace of it, how fast it had all moved, how prepared they had seemed, about Harlan saying, "I know what's in the record, and I know that some of it is incomplete." She thought about what it would mean to have those documents in a reporter's hands rather than only in JAG's files. "When were they sent?" she asked. Orford checked. 10:47 a.m. She did the math. 40 minutes after she'd given Hollis her formal statement. 20 minutes after Harlan had made a phone call she wasn't present for. She didn't say anything about that. "Can you verify them?" she asked. "I've already sent them to 2 people who can authenticate format and classification structure. I'm waiting on callbacks." He paused. "Emma, if these are real, they're real." He looked at her. He believed her, she could tell, and was deciding whether believing her was the same as having confirmation. In his business, it wasn't. But he was also looking at a woman who had read those 3 documents in 45 seconds and responded with the contained stillness of someone who had already known the approximate shape of what they said, and that told him something. "If these are real," he said again, more carefully, "then the story isn't just about this morning." "No," she said. "It isn't. The story is about what happened to you after Kelvar Valley, and why." Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Are you prepared for what that means? For you, personally, when this publishes? Emma thought about the conference room, the whiteboard, the wet box on the table. She thought about 2 years of granola bars and 30-minute check-ins and the specific exhaustion of competence that nobody sees. I've been prepared for it for 4 years, she said. I just wasn't ready until now. She went back upstairs and told Harlan about the documents. She told him calmly and without accusation, because she didn't know yet whether what she suspected was accurate, and because either way, it didn't change what she needed to do. She told him what Orford had, what it showed, and that Orford was in the process of verifying it. Harlan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The story is going to publish." "Yes." "Are you comfortable with that?" "I gave Orford clearance," she said. "He'll coordinate timing with your office so nothing classified is exposed. But the substance, yes, it publishes." Harlan looked at her for a long time. She couldn't fully read the expression. It wasn't disapproval. It wasn't relief either. It was something more complicated. The look of a man who had set something in motion and was watching it move in a direction he had perhaps wanted but could not entirely control, and was making his peace with that. "All right," he said. That was all. Hollis spent the next 3 hours on the phone. Some of those calls Emma was present for. Some she wasn't. What came through the door in pieces, delivered by Keel in his efficient shorthand, was the shape of what was happening. The medical board had elevated the inquiry from preliminary to formal. The 2 senior officers named in the email chain, the ones who had signed off on the revised Kelvar Valley memo, had been contacted by JAG. The hospital's legal team had informed Pelham that the civil complaint withdrawal was confirmed and that Rowe's attorney had indicated his client would not be seeking further legal action. At 6:15 p.m., Orford received his authentication confirmations. He called Emma. The documents were real. At 7 p.m., the Denton City Register published. The story ran long. Orford had written it the way good reporters write things that matter, without theater, without overwrought language, just the sequence of events laid out with enough context that the weight of them was self-evident. Emma Vasquez, former Army flight medic, 2 years at Harlow General under a deliberately reduced credential profile. A soldier's life saved twice before breakfast. A termination. A return. The footage. The prior complaints. The Kelvar Valley documents and what they showed about how a record had been revised and what that revision had cost the woman whose name was in it. He had included one quote from her at the end. She'd given it to him at 5:30, standing in the hospital parking lot in the February cold, which was not where she would have chosen to give a quote, but was where she'd been when he called. He'd asked her what she wanted people to understand. She'd thought about it for a moment. Then she'd said, "I wanted to be ordinary. I worked very hard at it for 2 years. It turns out that's not the same as being safe." That was the last line of the piece. The next several weeks were not clean. She had told herself they wouldn't be, and she'd been right. And being right about it didn't make it easier. There were interviews, there were formal proceedings, the medical board review, which took 11 weeks and concluded with the revocation of Marcus Rowe's medical license pending a mandatory 2-year suspension and mandatory retraining, with specific notations in the public record about the pattern of conduct and the prior complaints that had not been escalated. The language was procedural and dry and said, in the compressed formal vocabulary of institutional accountability, that a man had treated his judgment as categorically superior to the people around him for long enough that it had eventually cost someone their life. Not quite. Not this time, but close enough to matter. Rowe did not speak publicly. His attorney released a brief statement that said nothing. Emma did not read it. The Kelvar Valley Review moved more slowly, because these things always did, because the institutional machinery for correcting itself was not built for speed. But it moved. The original assessment memo, the accurate one, the first one, was restored as the operative record. The revision memo was flagged. The email chain was part of a separate proceeding that Emma was not directly involved in, and she made a deliberate choice not to track its progress too closely, because she had learned that some processes needed to happen without her watching them, or she would spend all her energy watching instead of moving. Reyes's file was corrected. His family was notified. Not by Emma. She was not part of that conversation. But she was told it had happened, and she held that for a while. In the complicated way you hold things that are right, but not enough. The shoulder still ached. She'd had it looked at properly, finally, by an orthopedic surgeon who had told her with the blunt candor of someone who didn't have a stake in her emotional response that she had significant rotator cuff damage that had been inadequately treated 4 years ago and would require surgery and a recovery period that she was not going to enjoy. She scheduled it for March. She was not looking forward to it. She said yes to Harlan's program. She said it 6 weeks after the morning at Harlow General, sitting in an office in a building that was not a hospital, with her credentials in order for the first time in 2 years, and the program documentation in front of her, and the particular sensation of a decision that has already been made long before the moment of saying it out loud. The curriculum development took 4 months. It was harder than she'd expected, which was good. Easy things had a tendency to not matter enough. She had opinions about everything, which she'd always known, and the program structure kept requiring her to defend those opinions to people who had their own, and the friction of that produced something better than either version alone would have been. She was not always right. She noted this privately and adjusted accordingly. Patrick moved to the new joint facility when it opened. She'd asked specifically for him. Aaron Thibodeau came back for the program launch in September. He walked in on his own power, which he had not been certain he would do when Emma had last seen him in room 412, and he stood near the back of the room during the opening remarks and did not draw attention to himself, which was consistent with everything she understood about him. Afterward, in the hallway, he said, "Good program." "It's a start," she said. "That's what I said. Good program." She almost smiled. He left without ceremony, which was also consistent. The thing about being underestimated for a long time is that it does something to you that you don't always notice until it stops. You start organizing your behavior around the assumption that what you know doesn't fully count, that your judgment is provisional, that the space you're allowed to occupy has a ceiling and the ceiling is set by someone else. You get good at working inside that space. You make yourself useful in ways that can't be argued with. You become precise and quiet, and you absorb the dismissals and you move on. And you tell yourself that's humility, that it's earned, appropriate, realistic, that the world is the shape it is. Emma had told herself that for 2 years. She had been wrong, not about the world, but about what she owed it. The morning at Harlow General had not been a transformation. She was not a different person on the other side of it. She still woke up some nights with the particular geography of the Kelvar Valley clear in her mind. She still pressed her hand against her shoulder out of habit, even after the surgery had changed what was there. She was still, in the ways that mattered, the same person who had walked into a hospital at 5:47 a.m. and poured herself a half cup of bad coffee and circled a note in a chart margin that said, "Watch." What had changed was the record. Not hers. She'd always known what was in her own record, the real one, the one that lived in what she'd done and who she'd done it with and what it had cost. The record that other people held, the one that said she was less than she was. That record had been corrected. Not perfectly, not completely, not without remainder, but corrected enough that the next person who looked at it would see something close to the truth. That mattered. It had always mattered. She had always known it mattered, even in the 2 years she'd spent trying to believe it didn't. There's a kind of strength that looks like silence, because it's learned that noise is expensive and the work doesn't require an audience. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need the credit while the hands are busy. It just shows up, reads the room, does what needs doing, and walks back into the rain. The world doesn't always see it. Institutions don't always reward it. The people standing in the room don't always say thank you. But every now and then, a monitor flatlines, and someone who is almost out the door turns around, and the record gets to say something true. That's enough. That has to be enough. And sometimes, not always, not cleanly, not without cost, it is.